Welcome back to the Justice to Healing podcast from the National Drug Court Resource Center. I'm Dr. Christina Lanier, one of the co-directors of this center. And joining me is Dr. Kristen DeVall, the other co-director.
Hello.
We are excited to have our guest join us remotely today from Alexandria, Virginia, to talk to us about the concept of recovery capital. We want to welcome Susan Broderick, the program director of the National DAs Association. Welcome, Susan.
Hi. Excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, we're very excited to have you. So before we jump into the topic of recovery capital, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and your career?
Sure. I started my career as a prosecutor in the Manhattan DA's office back in 1989. So, and I knew as a child growing up, I grew up in a family. Both my parents were alcoholics, but I had a grandmother who was involved in politics. She was way ahead of her time, and she used to take me down to Washington, D.C. And so ever since I was a little girl, I always said, when I grow up, I want to be a lawyer and I want to live in Washington, D.C. And it was funny because, I did not come from a long line of lawyers. In fact, my father hadn't even graduated college, but my grandmother, didn't bring any of that up, but just said, you can do whatever you put your mind to. And I was like, okay, I'm going to be a lawyer and eventually live in Washington, D.C. So it was really something that I felt in my soul. And I went to law school. And like I said, I started in the Manhattan DA's office in 1989. And I was there for 14 years. It was really the most incredible opportunity, really, to serve victims. I was very much about wanting to help people. And I feel like sometimes people get the wrong idea of prosecutors, and it's like, oh, you just want to send people to jail. And it's like, no, I want to help turn things around and make things better. And so I, started out with the minor cases, and then eventually I was in the domestic violence unit and then the sex crimes unit. I was also in the homicide bureau. And then it was actually after a big homicide that Mr. Morgenthau, who was the DA, called me into his office and he said, congratulations on that conviction. And I'm going to put you in charge of child abuse. And I was like, oh my God, that's the promotion. But, and I have to say that the 3 years that I spent as the deputy chief of child abuse in the family violence unit were 3 of the best years of my life, because I really got a chance to see how resilient children are, and seeing kids coming from like some really bad situations, but really overcoming that adversity. So eventually in 2003, I decided to, pursue my dream of living in DC. So I took a position with the National District Attorneys Association. And for a few years, I was a senior attorney and working on child abuse issues. And then there was a opportunity to be the director of the juvenile prosecutor program. So I took that on. And then in 2008, there was an opportunity to go over to Georgetown. So I went over to Georgetown, 10 years at Georgetown. And I think the clearest thing that came from Georgetown is that I'm not an academic. I'm a practitioner, and I'm a prosecutor at heart, because I believe in justice. I believe in fairness. I want to help the victims. I want to help offenders learn to change their behavior, and so that they don't have to continue in the downward cycle of both crime and very often what I call was addiction. And in 2019, I actually went back. And so now I'm back at the National DA's Association, and I'm working on the juvenile work as well as a lot of work around professional well-being. So that's really more related to the personal side of my life. So while I was the deputy bureau chief in Manhattan, it was actually July 15th, 2001, that I went to my first AA meeting. And it was because, once again, I had humiliated myself the night before because I drank too much. And it's something that, I knew for years that I drank differently from other people, but I often passed it off as, well, I can't be an alcoholic because I'm a prosecutor in the Manhattan DA's office. And one of my best excuses was that I didn't have a DWI, but I didn't have a quorum in that. So that was the main excuse. But it served me for a while. Well, I know as a fact that there's a lot of people who will make all sorts of excuses because they don't want to admit that they have a problem because of the stigma associated with addiction. And so when I went to my meeting, I did it really out of desperation because it was really like the straw that broke the camel's back. So when I came down to DC, I was pretty, I didn't tell a lot of people I was in recovery, but then I got involved in a project and it was 2010 and it was about adolescent treatment and recovery. And I went to a conference in Baltimore and there was a professor there from Harvard named John Kelly. And I always joke that I should get a tattoo of the date of December 10th, 2010, because that was the day that changed my life. Because John Kelly was speaking about the justice system and the motivational fulcrum that it can provide for so many people who come into the justice system with a drug or alcohol problem. And it's that initial leverage of the law that help people to initiate the change. Mm-hmm. And, I'm coming up on my 20-year anniversary in AA, and I have yet to meet anybody who came in because things were going great. But I've met a ton of people who've come in because they got in trouble, either because of DWI or something involving their behavior when they were using drugs and alcohol. And so for a lot of people, that consequence of a referral to the justice system can be a turning point in their lives. And so one of the things, John Kelly was just really a visionary in the field because most people were just completely focused on treatment and just focused on the problem and not talking about the bigger view of looking at solutions as well. And as a former prosecutor, that's really how I would approach cases. I wanted to find a solution that would be fair and just for everyone involved. And so I started working with John Kelly, and it was sometime after he created the Recovery Research Institute, which I encourage people. It's www.recoveryanswers.org. And I went up for the opening luncheon, and afterwards, John and I went out for coffee. And I said to him, I think it's wonderful that you are devoting your research to recovery. And I said, but I can tell you right now that my own recovery is a miracle. And I said, I drank alcoholically for probably the beginning when I first picked up a drink. And I haven't had a drink since my first meeting. And so to me, it's spiritual, it's a miracle. And he, very politely just smiled at me and he said, well, it could be part miracle, but you could also have high recovery. And so I started looking into Recovery Capital, and I realized that they measured my success. So since that time, I have been very passionate about speaking about Recovery Capital, bringing Recovery Capital across the justice system to prosecutors, judges, probation, anybody and everybody, because I believe it is a concept that really can turn lives around in a positive way.
That's great. I think sharing your story and recognizing that the recovery process looks different for different folks. So having some context for how you came to where you are today and your work, that's always helpful. So thanks for sharing. Can we go back a little bit, Susan, and talk about what is Recovery Capital?
Yeah, so Recovery Capital, quite simply, is just really the strengths and assets that help to both initiate and sustain recovery. And the research, it actually all stems from two researchers named Granfield and Cloud. They did a study, and it was looking at people who had experienced natural recovery. So it was people who had a problem and then were able to resolve that problem without resource, going to treatment or things like that. And so what they found was when they studied that group of people is that there were particular strengths and assets that when you have them, they help with recovery. And the good thing is that really everybody possesses these qualities, but some people have lower amounts. And so the wonderful thing about recovery capital is that everybody has it and it's dynamic. So if you're low in one area, then you can build it up. Generally, there's three different areas. So there's the personal capital, the social capital, and then the community capital. And the personal is really looking at your individual strengths and assets, looking at your personality, looking at your self-esteem, and just your personal qualities. So like in my case, I was lucky because I was pretty headstrong, and I did, like I said, my grandmother taught me that, anything you wanted to, and, if you put your mind to it, you can do it. So I was pretty tenacious. So I had that working in my favor. And in terms of social capital, again, those are very often the friends, family members, and peers that, you have support you. So in that instance as well, I had incredible support. Both my parents, while they were alcoholics when I was a child, they had both gotten sober as well. So they were very supportive. Some of my friends were like, "You're not an alcoholic. I drink the same amount that you drink." And I'm like, whatever. So, but any friends who I told who weren't, they were just like, wow, that's awesome. And then in terms of community capital, in New York City, there's AA meetings 24/7, and it was just so accessible. And, and then I started getting into other activities which I've had always, been going to the gym, but really doing other things. I actually started yoga after I got sober, but it truly is a way that it's very complementary to my sobriety. So that's generally so recovery capital, again, are in three areas, and recognizing that while everybody has it, and especially we see, like, when we're working with people in the deep end of the system, very often they have lower levels of capital around sometimes educational issues, sometimes vocational issues. So the key is working on building those up and having those serve as like the scaffolding to building their personal capital. So my idea is that what if we use that leverage of the justice system in a positive way? What if we use that leverage and start looking at people's recovery capital, start looking at using that referral as a turning point to help them get back on track? So I was writing a paper called Love, Hope, and Random Drug Testing. And I kept coming across the research of Professor David Beck. And he is a criminologist in the UK who looks at the parallels between recovery from addiction and desistance from offending. And in all honesty, I had no idea what the word desistance meant, and I had to look it up because, I don't have a PhD in criminology. I like to say I have a PhD in life, but, and I was like, okay, reduced recidivism, I get it. And it makes sense to me because once, they both are processes that involve a great deal of change. And so getting sober and, getting out of the justice cycle very often involves changing people, places, and things in your life. My new goal in life is to bring the concept of recovery capital across the justice, because I believe at every single intersection point, there are opportunities to look at an individual's recovery capital, measure it, identify the barriers, identify the low points, and then also build it. Because the great thing with recovery capital as compared to financial capital, like financial capital, you use it, you lose it. With recovery capital, the more you use it, the more you build, because it generates more. And so to me, I love this concept because, it not only makes sense to me when I was reading it, but I experienced it and I know it's true. And I do think that this is something that the justice system really needs right now, and especially because, and with everything going on, from the last year, and I'm just hearing more and more people turning to drugs and alcohol because of the isolation, because of the despair of, what happened in our country. So it seems really nice to be able to offer, a glimmer of hope.
Susan, that was a wonderful description of recovery capital and really provided the listener with a good foundation of what exactly recovery capital is. Could you provide us an example, maybe a practical example of how, at one of those intercepts that you mentioned, police, prosecutor, any of those, could use recovery capital or implement the concept?
Sure. So there's actually a number of ways to do it. So there are some tools out there. The assessment of recovery capital, the ARC, which is about, I think it's 100 questions. And then David Best has actually created called the RECAP. So that is not only a tool to help measure, but then it also, based on the answers to the questions, it creates sort of like a care plan
Mm.
for probation or whoever will be overseeing the case. And then it also allows for continuing evaluation and updates. So, there's different ways you can use one of the tools, either in, a DA diversion program, in a drug court, like I said, with a recovery program when people are getting ready to leave prison and return to the community. The other way, and I think this is a way that probably will appeal to a lot more people, because I think, people, especially in the justice system, are getting tired of so many tools, so many assessments, so many screenings.
Mhm.
And it's like, you know what? Don't ask me to do another screen here or another assessment, because we're already at, so one of the things we're doing is discussing these concepts more broadly. So talking about, recovery capital, the three components, what are the different things you're going to be looking for, along with other recovery-oriented programs and practices. So one of the things that David and other recovery researchers have found is the importance of assertive linkage.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that in a lot of programs, there are recommendations made to attend, community programming or self-help groups and things like that. And in one of David's studies, he found that the general practice is to hand people, a flyer or a brochure about a program, and then that's it. And in the study he did, he measured people who are just giving a flyer versus those who actually had somebody actively help them identify to go to and often go with them to that meeting.
Hmm.
And in the results of that study was that the people that were just given the flyer or the brochure, none of them went. And the people that had that active assertive linkage, 100% went. So again, these are just, and pretty intuitive, simple concepts that can make a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing, there's a big part of this that does involve the community. And one of the best things I ever heard is the difference between illness and wellness is I versus we.
Hmm.
And,
I
there's
like that.
still so much we don't know about addiction. It's a very complex disorder, and it has a lot of different components. It has a lot of different risk factors. But the one thing we know for sure about recovery is that you can't do it alone.
Mm-hmm.
And you need that connection.
Right. That's great. I think what really strikes me as one of the hallmark features of Recovery Capital is that it really focuses on the individual level, right? We live in a culture that focuses on individual level decision making and individual level change, which is part of the equation and part of, engaging in recovery, but also recognizing the role of your social network and your peer group.
Absolutely.
And what you can gain from that, because we all are part of a family. We all are part of a community, right, and a social network. And then also the role of the community. So the larger community playing a role in that as well. So I think all three of those levels are attended to within this recovery capital model, which we know
Absolutely.
from exactly what you've just described people seeing people as
It's
humans.
connection.
Yes. Yep.
It's connection.
Right.
And that was one of the things, when I first stopped drinking, that the relationships with these people, it was like we got each other at a
Mhm.
very deep level. And one of my other favorite researchers is George Valiant. He's now retired, but he did a famous study called the Harvard Grant Study. And he looked at the trajectory of two groups of young boys who later on became men in the Boston area. And it was this, I forget how many years they did it, but it was many, many years. That's why they called it a longitudinal study. And one of his major findings in that was that for the men in that study who had drug and alcohol problems, the best treatment was AA.
Mhm.
It was not medication. It was not hospitalization. It was AA. And I just remember thinking, like, he measured it too. Like, he was able to prove that this really turned lives around. And then he wrote a follow-up book called Spiritual Evolution. And it was all about the transformative power of positive emotion.
Mhm.
And I was like, yes. And so this book, it's actually, I would recommend it to anybody because each chapter is a different positive emotion. And I think one of the greatest things, at least I know for me, is having hope and believing that things can get better. Because if you don't have hope, what's the point?
Right.
And I remember even in the beginning of my sobriety, just hearing other people who were not drinking and were happy planted that little seed of hope, because for a very long time, I just had resigned myself
Mhm.
to the fact that, you're Irish, you drink too much, you come from a family of alcoholics, that's it.
Mhm.
Um, and then just being with people who didn't and realize the connection I had with them, that gave me hope. And so, and I think that's part of our spirit. And I know people get nervous when they hear about spirituality, and it's not religion. Like, spiritual, and one of my favorite lines is that, like, religion is for people who believe in hell, and spirituality is for people who have been there. And when I talk about spirituality, I just talk about, like, that part of us that are alive, or the part of us, like, when we get excited and happy. And, like, for me, it's driving in my car to the Rolling Stones or Bruce Springsteen. Like, that is my spirit. And it happens when I connect with other people that I really relate to. And so, and a lot of the definitions even of addiction talk about it being, it's a complex disorder with biological, psychological, and spiritual components. And so I think we have to make sure we're looking at everything. And the social component is such an important
Mhm.
part of this.
Right.
And I think that's really a key point of this, that nobody does this alone.
Mhm. Absolutely. And you hear a lot the idea of people, places, and things
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
within recovery. And I think when we think about how do we change people, places, and things, I think the recovery capital gives, case managers, probation
Right.
officers, a sort almost like a framework to think about, what do we mean by people, places, and things? How are we going to do that? Well, we can do that by, increasing human capital,
Yep.
better job or, higher levels of education. We can do that through changing peer groups, uh, getting them involved in, the recovery community locally, and then also
Yep.
engaging in, more larger community-wide efforts. So I think what you've described in terms of this model, recovery capital model, it really is the embodiment of how are we going to address the people, places, and things that we, know matter.
Yes.
So,
I
Yep.
agree, and I also think what came to my mind was the challenge of aftercare that treatment
Mm-hmm.
courts and other types of things face. I mean, we hear this same statement over and over again. We don't have an aftercare program, or we're not sure what to do in aftercare, or perhaps we quote unquote lose them, right, in the aftercare. So if we think about
Yep.
the recovery capital and building that up, then perhaps it will feed directly into the aftercare.
Yeah.
And so therefore aftercare will be its own entity within the recovery capital model. I think that's just great for sure.
Well, and especially since we're talking about a chronic condition. I
Right.
mean, what
Right.
other disease do you know, when I had breast cancer, I had follow-ups for 5 years after
Mhm.
surgery. And, I think part of it is because, addiction is still stigmatized in a
Mm.
sense. But, and the thing is that a lot of this can be done in the
Mhm.
you can do those recovery checkups. You can do that, the assertive linkage. And, one of the things, what you were just talking about too, in terms of those social networks, another way to kind of work out that plan is doing social identity mapping and also having people figure out, like, what is it that you really love to do?
Mhm.
What brings meaning and purpose? Because we're good in the court system in taking away, or try to be good, taking away the drugs and alcohol.
Mhm.
But if you just leave a void,
Right.
they're going to go back to drugs and alcohol
Yep.
because it was doing something for them.
Right.
Exactly.
So the idea of filling that void with positive people, places, and things, activities
Mhm.
that they enjoy, that provide purpose. So all of this is a way to really ensure long-term recovery and long-term, non-involvement in the justice system. And, that's really the holy grail of the justice system is we want to turn people's lives around and get them out of the justice system so that they can have a happy, healthy life.
Right.
So I just think that this is a way to do all of that. And again, a lot of it can be done, collaboratively, working it in your community.
Great.
Well, congratulations
Thank
on
you.
coming up on your 20th anniversary. That
I
is
know.
something to be
It's
very
it's
proud
good.
of for
In some
sure.
ways, it feels like yesterday.
Right. That's amazing. Yeah. Great. Susan, thank you so much. That's incredibly helpful. And so we would like to provide our listeners with essentially a call to action. Think about how you can incorporate this idea of recovery capital into whatever your position is within the treatment court and larger criminal justice system. So, do you have any suggestions for how folks can learn more about recovery capital?
Sure. Well, I think the good news is now that a lot of different organizations representing the different stakeholders are recognizing the promise and what an innovative and really solution focused
Mhm.
concept recovery capital is. So, as I mentioned, NADCP, I'm doing some work with them now. We're doing it in the juvenile courts, but they're also going to be expanding it into some of the adult mentor courts. So you can check with NADCP about the treatment court side of it. And as I mentioned, I'm also doing something at the NDAA about it. So if anybody's interested in learning more from the prosecutor perspective or the early intervention diversion component of it, you can reach out to me. If anybody wants to learn more, feel free to reach out. My email address is sbroderick at ndaajustice.org. And I'd be happy to tell you more about the concept. It's something that really I'm dedicating my heart and my soul to because I know from my own experience. And that's usually the greatest way to truly appreciate something is when you experience it. And I know this to be true. And that's why I want to try to bring this across the entire justice. And it looks like there's a lot of people in the justice system who are very excited about this too. So that makes me really happy. And I'm so thrilled to be part of this podcast today. And I'm a big fan of the work that you're doing at your center and definitely want to find ways to collaborate with everybody and anyone because this is something that can happen in every community across the country.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan, for joining us today. We really appreciate your willingness to share your story and then also the amazing work that you're doing around recovery capital. We think that this will really be helpful to folks in recovery and also those that are engaging with treatment court participants. So we thank you for that. To our listeners, thank you so much for being with us today. We hope this information regarding recovery capital is useful to you. and that you can begin to incorporate this in your work. Please join us on the ndcrc.org Justice to Healing discussion board to continue the discussion about recovery capital. Join us next month for the 5th episode of the Justice to Healing podcast, and always remember to do better.
To our listeners, we thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the show. Be sure to hit subscribe to stay updated on the podcast. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn to stay engaged with us, and check out our website at ndcrc.org. Thanks again. Catch you next time on Justice to Healing. The Justice to Healing podcast is presented by the National Drug Court Resource Center and was supported by the grant number 2019 DC-BXK002, awarded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, which also includes the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the National Institute of Justice, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the Office for Victims of Crime, and the SMART Office. Points of view or opinions in this podcast are those of the author and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the United States Department of Justice.